Hey, welcome back to the Ready State. Yeah, we're back on the rowing machine, but we're not talking about the rowing machine. We're talking about what goes on with your spine when you flex it and extend it. Now, one of my favorite things is to try to interpret old coaching cues. I like the bench. It ties the arms to the body. Like, I don't even know what that means. What does that mean? Ties the arms to the body. Well, I think I know what it means. People who can bench, man, they had good stable shoulders and they could create a ton of rotation, and they tended to tackle with their thumbs up and elbows in, and they didn't dislocate. Okay. So one of the things that we hear a lot of is how you finish. How you start is how you finish, right? And you're kind of like, what does that mean exactly? Well, our concept of the tunnel means that when we enter a movement or initiate a movement, the start position is definitely a component to how well you can finish. So if you're missing internal rotation in your snatch, shoulder comes forward, man, it is hard to have your shoulder in a rock solid position when you receive that snatch if you've already had to compensate. So compensation can be part of that. Sometimes just not having good technique can be part of it, or missing range of motion can dictate how you finish. Well, it turns out sometimes how you finish dictates how you start, which means that if I'm running and I'm running and my hand flares out, man, it's difficult for me to come through and actually have good motion in my upper body, right? Because I've flared, because I don't have an extension, that means that I end up with a really weird running mechanic. Or imagine your shoulder, or imagine your back, or you can imagine any of the sort of repetitive motions of swimming, running, et cetera, or even here we're rowing. So one of the things that we see is that when people are missing full flexion of the hip, right, they will close this hip angle down and manage a force in the spine that's being pushed backwards by using the available musculature. In this situation, this isn't so different than being at a really excellent catch position, right? And if I don't have this full range, I might have to come up with my toes a little bit. That seems very reasonable. But if I still am forcing the knee to the chest and it's work to get here, one of the ways that my brain will stabilize is by turning on some of the anterior musculature of the spine, and I end up in this position. And what you're thinking is, you're seeing my back, but what you're not seeing is that my belly is now dragging me, taking my spine and dragging it into extension so I can hold this position. So now I have this belly that's distended, and what's happening here in this position, right, if I stood up, that's not a good look. My belly is dragging me over into this position. What we say is that we're trying to disrupt the system as little as possible, especially when I'm going over and over again. So if this content in a well-stiffened, appropriately organized trunk, as I hinge, I may see bulging out because of the intra-abdominal pressures, but I should not see a herniation in the middle of that system. And we see that when people are squatting, when they're deadlifting, when they're hinging. Even if they get into a plank, spine drops into extension, you see that herniation. Now, I don't mean spine herniation, I'm just discussing it like a hot dog. So if you're baking a hot dog and you see a bubble, that's a herniation in the sheath. An extension out of a system that's designed to shrink and contract towards the spine. So as we come back to rowing now, one of the things that we see is that if I don't have enough hip flexion or can't close the hip effectively, then I'll use my anterior structures, even rectus femoris, QL, psoas iliacus, to close this position down for me. Now I have introduced a whole bunch of competing forces on the spine. Shear forces on the pelvis, forces on the inside of the pelvis. I've got psoas yanking forward, QL yanking back. So yes, I can get into this catch position and crank myself forward. But the problem is I load that, man, I end up in this position where my belly's out, difficult to get any shoulder retraction here, and it's difficult for me to undo that so that as I come back and let the boat run underneath me, I end up maintaining my length, maintaining my breath. So if I don't have enough hip flexion, how I start is how I finish. Well, it turns out if I'm starting in a compensated position on the recovery, going to move to recovery, but have this system going, holding out here, that means that how I finished is going to dictate my next start. So what we find is that a lot of complex features around the spine, under load, under intensity, under sport demands, can be simplified by appreciating that when I squat, these relationships should stay the same. And if I'm seeing a huge change in the volume of my abdomen outward, for us that represents a less effective stabilizing position. Certainly one stabilizing strategy, but as we try to untangle some of the mess that goes on around breathing and head position and stabilization, we're trying to create positions and shapes that translate, that transfer. And if you can identify this signature of compensation as, hey, when I'm at compression here, I should be belly to the spine, right? I shouldn't be pushing out to create stability through that system. That has confused a lot of people for a long time. And if you look at our best Chinese Olympic lifters under hugest loads, there's not a lot of movement that happens in the spine. In fact, they talk about it. Even Pavel says you got to breathe behind the shield, which means you better pick up breathing in all these other places. But this is a fundamental breakdown of the system, in so much that it doesn't transfer, creates other problems I'm going to have to solve down the chain. So if you are trying to hip hinge, you're bending over to pick something up off the ground, your belly button should be coming towards your spine to maintain the integrity of the spine. If the belly bulges out, yes, you have defaulted and changed the mechanics, and it feels like you can hit this position effortlessly, but you have a shape that doesn't handle shear loads, doesn't handle flexion loads. It's sort of pell-mell, willy-nilly about all the different competing forces on it. We're trying to simplify the system so that we can put the most load into the hip, not compete against my own stabilization strategy, so that as I jump, or I'm pushing, or getting that catch, or I'm in my first or second push, if I'm already using my psoas, QL, quadratus, everything to yank myself into this position, what are the chances that I'm going to be able to unload that and get to full hip extension? I don't. I end up seeing a ton of weird issues. How you start is how you finish, but also how you finish will dictate your next start.